You're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast.
And this is the top 5 best vice presidents.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential lore. 3, who will the top 5 be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, let's go down the gun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
And I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas. And we're going to talk about vice
presidents.
That's right. Who's the best vice?
Yeah, a lot of vice presidents never really made their mark. Vice presidency doesn't have many official duties. A lot of vice presidents not really finding something to do.
Yeah. It seems like it's a purely ceremonial position.
Well,
in some aspects.
but some vice presidents made more of it than others.
Indeed, and they turned it into the position that it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's right, James. The vice president, seen as something of kind of a ceremonial position, as John Adams would attest at the very beginning, but he and others of his ilk kind of transformed this office and made it into the current vice presidency.
That's right. A lot of vice presidents back in the day kind of could do basically nothing for a long time. And then others took advantage of their spot right below the president and tried to throw around some influence in various ways.
That's it, and we're going to take a look at our nation's top 5 best vice presidents here as we dive into the top 5 best vice presidents.
Number 5.
Garrett Hobart.
Garrett Hobart spent 10 years in the New Jersey State Legislature, serving as both Speaker of the Assembly and President of the Senate. He never sought national office. He was reluctant to give up his home life and his extremely successful career as a corporate lawyer. He served on many corporate boards and was a court-appointed receiver who reorganized bankrupt railroads. And despite his lack of a national reputation, he was among the most influential Republicans in his state, and he served as a delegate to every Republican National Convention from 1876 onward.
That's it. In 1896, Republicans nominated Ohio Governor William McKinley for president and sought an Easterner to balance the ticket. After House Speaker Thomas Reed of Maine said no, the nomination was offered to Garrett Hobart, who accepted. He convinced McKinley to focus on the gold standard as the decisive issue of the campaign against the pro-silver Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. Hobart argued, quote, "An honest dollar, worth 100 cents everywhere, cannot be coined out of 53 cents worth of silver plus a legislative fiat. Such a debasement of our currency would inevitably produce incalculable loss, appalling disaster, and national dishonor." The McKinley-Hobart ticket won the election, and Republicans captured New Jersey's electoral votes for the first time since 1872.
That's right. And as Vice President, Hobart and his wife developed a very close relationship with the McKinleys. Jenny Hobart visited Ida McKinley every day and often filled in as White House hostess due to Ida's poor health.
Yeah, this is kind of the vice president and his wife making more of a social scene in Washington than really had been done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and using their personal relationship with the McKinleys, who they didn't really know before this, but they became very good friends. Hobart became one of McKinley's closest advisors, and he was also extremely effective as president of the Senate, which is, of course, the only official duty of the vice president.
Yeah.
Hobart was a constant presence there. He took charge on procedural questions and helped shepherd McKinley's legislative agenda through Congress. A McKinley biographer wrote that Hobart was, quote, almost the president's alter ego, turning every screw with his legendary politeness. He had expanded the vice president's traditional role so much that he earned the nickname Assistant President.
Yeah, and that's really something to say because, as you'll learn here, the vice presidential role, it took a long time for that to really expand. Mm-hmm. But Hobart really stepping up to the plate here.
Yeah, and if you look at the names of vice presidents for really the previous almost century before Hobart, except for the ones who ended up becoming president themselves, most people have never even heard of those names.
Right.
And they didn't really do much when they were vice president.
That's it. Now, McKinley, he had experienced personal financial difficulties. He even gave Hobart part of his presidential salary to invest. Mm-hmm. So that's how much stock he holds in Garrett Hobart.
Yeah.
That really says something. In 1898, McKinley appoints Hobart's New Jersey protege John Griggs as Attorney General. In 1899, Hobart cast his only tie-breaking vote in the Senate to defeat an amendment that would have granted independence to the U.S.'s newly acquired territory of the Philippines. By late 1898, however, Hobart had fallen ill with a serious heart ailment. Nevertheless, Ohio Senator and turn-of-the-century Karl Rove, Mark Hanna, said that, quote, "Nothing but death or an earthquake can stop the renomination of Vice President Hobart in 1900. Despite Hobart's declining health, McKinley entrusted him the delicate task of informing War Secretary Russell Alger that the president wanted him to resign.
Yep.
So there's some important stuff falling into Hobart's lap here, and that's, it's pretty unprecedented in history up to this point.
Yeah, McKinley really relying on him for a lot of things. But Hobart's in poor health, and after vacationing with the McKinleys in the summer of 1899, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He died on November 21st, 1899, at the age of 55, and was the sixth vice president to die in office. McKinley told Hobart's family, quote, "No one outside of this home feels this loss more deeply than I do." In 1900, Hobart's spot on the ticket was filled by New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president when McKinley was assassinated 6 months into his second term.
And what a difference in history, we could have seen there. What if Garrett Hobart had hung on?
Yeah,
and we could have had President Hobart.
If he would have remained in perfect health, we could have had a long presidency of President Garrett Hobart.
Yeah, it's a distinct possibility. Not an unpopular man, but, generally remembered for dying in office.
Yep.
Which is something we've sought to remedy today.
Yep. Now he'll be remembered for being a very effective vice president.
Indeed.
Speaking of effective vice presidents,
the top 5 best vice presidents.
Number 4.
Richard Nixon.
Yep, Nixon served in the Navy during World War II, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander. 1946, he defeated a 5-time Democratic incumbent to win election to the U.S. House of Representatives from California's 12th District. His vigorous anti-communist efforts on the House Un-American Activities Committee were instrumental in exposing State Department official Alger Hiss as a Soviet spy. In 1950, Nixon was elected to represent California in the U.S. Senate. 1952, at the age of 39, he was chosen by party leaders to be General Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice presidential running mate.
During the campaign, Nixon comes under fire over reports of a fund maintained by his supporters to cover his political expenses, with some calling for Eisenhower to drop him from the ticket. Nixon responded with a televised address, the famous Checkers speech, in which he denied any impropriety, highlighted his modest upbringing, and stated that no matter what, he would not return one gift, a Cocker Spaniel that his children had named Checkers. The emotional speech was heard by an unprecedented 60 million Americans, and it garnered him huge support. The Eisenhower-Nixon ticket won a dominating victory in the November election.
That's right, and then Eisenhower would give his vice president a pretty substantial role. Nixon attended meetings of the cabinet and the National Security Council. He presided over those meetings when Eisenhower was absent. Eisenhower relied on Nixon's political skills in working with Congress. Nixon initially had successfully persuaded the red-baiting Senator Joe McCarthy to back off some attacks on some of Eisenhower's appointees. In October 1953, Eisenhower sent Nixon on a 2-month goodwill tour of Asia, during which he visited many countries, including Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Vietnam, and South Korea, where he ordered its government to give up plans of reinvading North Korea. Eisenhower recorded in his diary that Nixon, quote, is not only bright, quick, and energetic, but also loyal and cooperative. One biographer suggested that Nixon deserves to be called the first modern vice president due to his expanded role and his tireless work on behalf of the president's objectives.
That's it. And Nixon's role almost changed completely in September of 1955 when Eisenhower suffered a serious heart attack. It was considered life-threatening, and he was unable to perform his duties for 6 weeks. Now, Nixon knew he had to be ready to become president of the United States should Eisenhower die, but at the same time, he recognized that, quote, I must do nothing which could possibly be interpreted as a move toward usurping the duties and powers of the president. He would preside over cabinet meetings, but he refused to sit in the president's chair. He met with cabinet secretaries in their offices rather than summoning them to his. Nixon received high praise for his conduct during this crisis and was described as, quote, behaving like a model vice president.
That's right. Then in 1958, Nixon was sent on a goodwill tour of South America. In Lima, Peru, he confronted a mob of anti-American protesters who threw rocks at him and spit on him. In Caracas, Venezuela, a mob attacked his motorcade and broke the window of his limousine.
Yeah, you could look up footage of that on YouTube, and it's pretty crazy.
Wow.
It's a harrowing situation.
Yeah. In the United States, Nixon was seen as coolly defending the nation's honor, and his conduct, quote, caused even some of his bitterest enemies to give him some grudging respect. He believed that the protesters had been directed and controlled by a central communist conspiracy, and the State Department and CIA agreed.
That's it. In 1959, Nixon is going to represent the U.S. at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, where he meets with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In a televised exchange inside a model American kitchen, the two engaged in an impromptu exchange about the merits of capitalism versus communism, which became known as the kitchen debate. Time magazine is going to praise Nixon's performance here, saying that he, quote, managed in a unique way to personify a national character proud of peaceful accomplishment, sure of its way of life, confident of its power under threat. And there's some great quotes from that, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
At one point in the kitchen debate, Khrushchev told Nixon that his grandchildren would grow up communist. And Nixon retorted, Khrushchev's grandchildren would grow up in freedom.
Hmm. Well, maybe neither of them turned out to be right.
Yeah.
I don't think Russia quite has freedom yet. But Nixon stood up for American values there. And he did such a good job as vice president that in 1960 he won the Republican presidential nomination without serious opposition. Went on, of course, to be narrowly defeated by John F. Kennedy in the general election.
Yeah.
But he would live to fight another day.
He would. And one thing I do want to say about Nixon 1960, Eisenhower did not really campaign for him.
No.
He didn't really do much at all to help Nixon's cause there. And, we'll talk about it at a later point, but there were some questionable aspects to that election. And, maybe Nixon took the high road in not demanding a recount when maybe it was justified. Who knows?
Well, we'll get into that in episode 35 and 37 of the Dead Presidents podcast.
But for now, we're going to turn our attention to the top 5 vice presidents.
Number 3.
John Adams. Now, before the 12th Amendment, the vice president was not separately elected. Electors of the Electoral College each cast 2 votes, and whoever had the most votes would be president, and the second most, vice president. In 1788, the first election under the new Constitution, all 69 electors voted for George Washington. 11 other men received votes, but John Adams was the clear winner of the vice presidency, receiving 34 votes, while the next highest choice, John Jay, got only 9. While Washington would set many important precedents as the first president, Adams would have a similar role in setting precedents for the office of vice president. Addressing the Senate, he said, quote, "Gentlemen, I feel a great difficulty how to act. I am vice president. In this I am nothing, but I may be everything."
Yeah. And he was the first vice president who had to figure out, what the heck is this office?
Yeah.
And, because he had done distinguished service in the Revolution, a leading member of Continental Congress, was a major diplomat in Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and now he's going to find himself dismayed by the vice presidency's meager formal duties. He complained to his wife Abigail, quote, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Washington did not consider the vice president a member of the cabinet and rarely consulted him on executive decision-making.
Yeah, and it just brings to mind HBO, John Adams, with Paul Giamatti. The first cabinet meeting where there's like, "You may be excused, Mr. Adams," and he's like,
Yep.
huh?
And there's the one scene where he's like sitting out in the hall when they're having their
they're
meeting.
having an argument out in there.
Yeah, it's a tough spot he found himself in, but I think the way he conducted himself really put,
Well, it definitely set forth a decent standard. The vice president's only constitutional duty to preside over the Senate. He found it difficult to sit in the Senate without really being able to participate in the debates. This guy is a master debater, and here he has to just kind of sit in silence while other people make arguments, and he cannot offer any input. And that's difficult for him. Early in his tenure, he becomes mired in controversy when the Senate is considering official titles for officers of the new government. Adams believed that formal titles would convey dignity and respect, and suggested that Washington be called, quote, "His Majesty the President." He was heavily criticized for interjecting himself into the debate, and opponents joked that he should be called His Rotundity.
Yeah, he was very opinionated, loved to hear himself talk, and maybe overstepped a little bit at first as president of the Senate, but eventually he settled in to his role as presiding officer and didn't participate much in the debates, concentrated on the procedure, but he would maintain perfect attendance in the Senate. It was a point of pride for him to always be there.
Yep.
One senator would praise his conduct as, quote, "attentive, upright, fair, and unexceptionable." He cast 29 tie-breaking votes.
Right.
That's setting a record that has never been surpassed. I believe I've seen a couple conflicting things. One thing had John C. Calhoun ahead of him, but others had Calhoun below him. Not necessarily exact numbers for these kind of things. People have to dig back through the old records of Congress. But John Adams right up there off the bat with a lot of tie-breaking votes.
Yeah, so thereby
Exercising some influence.
Yep.
One of his tie-breaking votes defeated a proposal that would have required the president to obtain the Senate's consent to remove cabinet officers. When opponents said that Adams cast his vote with the president only because he, quote, looked up to that goal, he responded, I am forced to look up to it and bound by duty to do so because there is only one breath of one mortal between me and it.
Oof.
He cast another tie-breaking vote against a proposal to keep the federal capital in New York, thus enabling it to move temporarily to Philadelphia and then permanently to Washington, D.C.
That's it. So he's involved in some important stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
In 1792, Adams is re-elected vice president, receiving 77 electoral votes. His closest competition was New York Governor George Clinton, who got 50 votes. In his second term, Adams deplored the increasing partisan divisiveness and privately criticized Jefferson, whom he saw as driven by, quote, a blind spirit of party and consumed with ambition to become the next president. He also parted ways with Jefferson on the issue of the French Revolution, as biographer David McCullough wrote, quote, ahead of anyone in the government, and more clearly than any, Adams foresaw the French Revolution leading to chaos, horror, and ultimate tyranny.
That's right. Towards the end of Washington's administration, with the more distinguished members of his first cabinet all having left office, he did begin to consult Vice President Adams a little more often. When he was faced with one of the most difficult decisions of his presidency, whether to sign the unpopular Jay Treaty, Washington invited Adams to dine alone with him. Adams advised Washington to sign the treaty, knowing from his own extensive diplomatic experience that it was the best deal possible and the only way to prevent war with Britain. Washington followed his advice and signed the treaty, and Adams stood by Washington in the firestorm of criticism that ensued.
Yeah, it brings to mind another scene in the show where they're there and Washington says, I know what it's like to be hated. You know? Oh, man, so well done. But in 1796, Washington, he announces that he's not going to stand for a third term. Federalist members of Congress, they hold an informal caucus and nominate Adams for president. Republicans nominate Jefferson. Adams prevails in the Electoral College by the narrow margin of 71 to 68. Adams becomes the second president, with Jefferson as the second vice president. John Adams, man. The first vice president, I mean, good Lord.
Setting the office in motion. We talked about, as president, he had the tough job of being president without being George Washington.
Yeah.
The immortal George Washington. But he had kind of like an 8-year audition for that, of trying to be the second figure in the government who is just not George Washington.
And really, by the majority of accounts, he did a pretty good job. And that's going to bring us on to the top 5 vice presidents.
Number 2.
George H.W. Bush.
He's the son of Connecticut Senator Prescott Bush. George H.W. Bush served as a Navy bomber pilot during World War II, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross after being shot down in the Pacific Theater. He graduated from Yale and moved to Texas, where he started a successful oil development company and won election to the U.S. House of Representatives. Went on to serve as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Chairman of the Republican National Committee, de facto Ambassador to China, and Director of the CIA. In 1980, he ran for the Republican presidential nomination and was decisively defeated by Ronald Reagan. But when Reagan's negotiations to name former President Gerald Ford as his running mate broke down, he offered the job to Bush, who accepted. Now, these two had traded barbs during the primary campaign, and Bush had derided Reagan's economic plan as, quote, voodoo economics. And they would have to work to establish a close relationship.
That's it. Bush's vice presidency, it's going to get off on the right foot when his friend and campaign manager James Baker is named White House Chief of Staff. Reagan decides to give Bush substantial responsibilities, later recalling, quote, "I thought that it was prudent and important for the country for the vice president to play as large a role in the affairs of the administration as possible." Bush was put in charge of the National Security Crisis Management Group, a position usually held by the National Security Advisor. He was appointed to run the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, reviewing hundreds of regulations and making recommendations that would reduce costs and cut red tape. He also chaired a task force on efforts to stop international drug smuggling.
Yep. And on March 30th, 1981, just over 2 months after the inauguration, Bush was touring Texas when he heard that President Reagan had just been shot. John Hinckley, number 1 on our list of top 5 failed assassins, had fired several bullets, one of which ricocheted off the presidential limo and hit Reagan in the chest, ending up an inch from his heart. And with Reagan in emergency surgery, Bush flew immediately back to Washington. His advisors wanted him to take a helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House, but Bush refused, believing that it would make Reagan look weak. Bush said, quote, "Only the president lands on the South Lawn." Bush impressed those around him by maintaining perfect calm throughout this crisis. He was very careful not to upstage Reagan and shut down any talk about assuming presidential powers under the 25th Amendment. He told the cabinet, quote, "The president is still the president. He is not incapacitated, and I am not going to be a substitute president. I'm here to sit in for him while he recuperates, but he's going to call the shots." Bush later recalled, quote, "He was the president, I wasn't. A president has enough to worry about without having to worry that his vice president is undercutting him or trying to make himself look good at the president's expense. I had decided that he deserved my total loyalty, and he got it." The New York Times wrote that Bush struck just the right tone, and his conduct contrasted favorably with that of Secretary of State Alexander Haig,
Yeah.
who committed the infamous gaffe of claiming that he was, quote, "in control at the White House," while misstating the presidential line of succession.
Right.
Reagan was very impressed with Bush's performance, and the episode cemented their good relationship. Thereafter, they would have lunch together every Thursday, and Bush made a point of never publicly divulging any advice he gave Reagan in private.
That's right. Quite a situation there.
Yeah.
And, yeah, George H.W. Bush really handling it quite professionally.
Yeah, I think, everyone around him was amazed by how calm he was. And I think he said, even at the time, he's like, the thought of me having to make like major decisions about like the Soviet Union or something, like that doesn't bother me at all. What I'm really thinking about now is like my friend is hurt.
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways that episode there is kind of like certainly his finest hour as vice president, and maybe the finest hour of the vice presidency as a whole in a lot of ways.
That could be argued. It definitely cemented their friendship. It sealed the deal on their ticket. I mean, being a strong one. In 1983, Bush is going to tour Western Europe in a successful effort to persuade NATO allies to back the deployment of nuclear missile defenses in Europe. In 84, he debates Democratic vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro during a re-election campaign that resulted in the Reagan-Bush ticket winning 49 states. A crushing victory.
Indeed.
For 8 hours in 1985, Bush became the first vice president to serve as acting president under the 25th Amendment when Reagan underwent surgery to remove polyps from his colon. Ouch. In 1986, when the administration became embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandal, Bush said he was, quote, out of the loop, and didn't know the administration was using arms sales in Iran to fund Nicaraguan sounded like Barbara Walters there for a second. And didn't know the administration was using arms sales in Iran to fund Nicaraguan rebels in violation of a congressional ban on such funding. Iran was receiving the arms sales in exchange for its efforts to secure the release of Americans held hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah. Subsequent investigations never implicated Bush in any wrongdoing, but many believed he knew more than he admitted to, including in an infamous exchange, Dan Rather.
Yeah.
You could look that up on YouTube. Just literally go to YouTube and type in Rather v. Bush or Bush v. Rather, and there's a 10-minute video on there that gets heated. Throughout the scandal, Bush loyally refused to disclose any private conversations he had with the president. And, I think objectively, from my point of view, he handled that Rather exchange pretty good.
Yeah, because he's already running for president himself at the time.
That's it.
And
yeah, he's the sitting vice president. He's running for president. According to him, CBS contacts him and says, like, hey, we're doing political profiles on all the candidates, so we're going to do like a 10-minute piece where you could talk about your platforms there, to talk about education, talk about bringing down the deficit, all that fun stuff. And Bush is like, okay. And then he immediately gets on there and is backhanded with, what did you know? What didn't you know? Are you lying? About all this stuff. And, it gets heated, but Bush handled himself okay.
Yeah, he didn't get pushed around. And, well, his campaign ended up working out, because in 1988, he won the nomination and defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in the general election. He became the first sitting vice president to be elected president since Martin Van Buren in 1836.
Pretty crazy to think about. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Well, of course, at the beginning, as we've talked about at the show, Secretary of State's always been that stepping stone to the presidency, not the vice president.
Well,
the second in command hasn't been necessarily the first choice.
Yeah, for a lot of years, the vice president wasn't really commanding anything, but Bush had a pretty substantial vice presidency, and he was lucky to be the successor to a guy who really transformed the vice presidency.
That's going to bring us on down to the top 5 vice presidents.
Number 1.
Walter Mondale. Mondale served as Attorney General of Minnesota before being appointed to the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Hubert Humphrey when he became vice president in 1964 under LBJ. He tested the waters for a presidential campaign in 1976, but ultimately declined to run. After Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter won the nomination, Mondale was among 6 Democratic senators considered for the vice presidential spot. In an interview with Carter at his Plains, Georgia home, Mondale said he would not be interested in giving up his Senate seat for a purely ceremonial position and insisted on playing a substantial role, quote, a useful instrument of government. Carter saw that Mondale was, quote, extremely well prepared for the interview and felt more compatibility with him than any other potential nominee. The Carter-Mondale ticket won a narrow victory over President Gerald Ford and his running mate, Senator Bob Dole.
Yep, and Mondale held Carter to his promise to provide him with a substantial role, and in doing so, revolutionized the office of vice president.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is truly the turning point of the vice presidential office here.
Yeah, Mondale was the first vice president to have an office in the West Wing of the White House. The vice president's office had traditionally been in the executive office building next door, but as Mondale put it, quote, if you're in the executive office building, you might as well be in Baltimore. Mondale had a large vice presidential staff that was integrated to work right alongside the president's staff.
That's it. And Carter invites Mondale to every meeting he schedules. The two have private lunches every Monday. Mondale receives the same daily intelligence briefing as the president, and he regularly meets with the National Security Council. One Carter chief of staff noted that Mondale, quote, had unprecedented access to the president. Another stated, quote, I consider I work for Mondale. He's my second boss, the way Carter is my first boss. Jimmy Carter had actually suggested that Mondale himself serve as White House chief of staff, but Mondale turned down the role to avoid being bogged down in administrative details. Mondale minimized his ceremonial duties and avoided specific assignments, instead serving as a high-level advisor who was consulted on all issues.
Mondale would defer to Carter in all group settings and rarely spoke up in big meetings, knowing that he could later share his opinions with the president one-on-one. And Carter actually threatened to fire any staff member who couldn't get along with the vice president. Mondale later recalled, quote, we understood each other's needs. We respected each other's opinions. We kept each other's confidence. Our relationship in the White House held up under the searing pressure of that place because we entered our offices understanding, perhaps for the first time in the history of those offices, that each of us could do a better job if we maintained the trust of the other. And for 4 years, that trust endured.
Yeah, and I think the big phrase to take out of that is perhaps for the first time in the history of those offices. You know, pretty much. And boy, what a leap for the vice presidency. In 1977, Mondale helps to defeat an effort to filibuster Carter's proposal to deregulate natural gas, using his powers as presiding office of the Senate to rule out of order many proposed amendments intended to obstruct the bill. In 1978, Carter is hesitant to veto a large defense appropriations bill because he fears Congress is going to override his veto. Mondale advises him to go ahead with it. Carter did so, and Congress was unable to override it.
Nice. This Mondale guy seems to give some pretty good advice. Well, in 1979, there was a time where Carter failed to follow Mondale's advice and paid the price for it.
Boy, did he.
Mondale argued vociferously against Carter's crisis of confidence speech, popularly known as the Malaise speech.
Yeah, how about a bag of Malaise potato chips, James?
Well, Mondale contended, quote, the crisis in confidence was not among the American people, that it was in our own leadership, and that we had to be careful not to appear to be pointing the finger at them rather than at us. Carter went ahead with the speech anyway, and that speech, combined with the firing of 6 cabinet members 2 days afterward, quote, contributed to the notion of Carter as a floundering leader.
Yeah.
Mondale took on a less visible role toward the end of Carter's term, feeling that there was little he could do to turn things around. The Carter-Mondale ticket suffered a decisive defeat in 1980 at the hands of Reagan-Bush.
Mondale's going to go on to win the 1984 Democratic presidential nomination, and he makes history by choosing Geraldine Ferraro as the first female vice presidential candidate. However, Mondale is going to suffer a crushing defeat in the general election, winning only the District of Columbia and his home state of Minnesota. In 1993, President Clinton named old Fritz Mondale U.S. Ambassador to Japan.
Yep, and he was proud to be sworn into that office by a fellow Democratic vice president,
Yep.
Al Gore.
Indeed. And a pretty important figure in vice presidential history, Walter Fritz Mondale.
We have him to thank more than anyone else for the modern vice presidency,
Indeed.
where the vice president takes on an active role as the number 2 person in the administration, the point man for the president on a lot of things.
Well, yeah, because just by looking at the list here, what spaces between people that were truly effective? John Adams, the first vice president, Garrett Hobart, McKinley's, and even then, Nixon was like the prototype Mondale in a sense. Mm-hmm. And Mondale really solidified it and created the modern vice presidency that you see people like George H.W. Bush kind of taking on that mantle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of it a lot has to do with the way the vice president is chosen. Because the vice president's role is, as much as the president wants it to be. And nowadays, the presidential candidate personally handpicks who the vice presidential nominee is going to be. So whether the vice president is someone the president feels they can trust, now they at least get to pick the guy. It didn't used to be that way. Before the 12th Amendment, the vice president was almost constitutionally set up to be the president's top rival.
Right.
Would become vice president. And then even after that, it's before there are elective primaries and the nominations are decided at the convention. The convention is picking the vice president. The guy who just got nominated president is not even there and often has little to no choice in who the vice president is.
And that's going to lead to some issues that we'll probably talk about on next month's Top 5. Mm-hmm. But we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We do have some honorable mentions here.
Yeah, there are a lot of good vice presidents. And it was hard to narrow it down. We have a handful of honorable mentions that we want to honorably mention.
That's it. So let's start with Al Gore. Mm-hmm. Al Gore, active vice president on the Walter Mondale model. He had weekly lunches and daily conversations with President Clinton, who consulted him on high-level decisions. Gore was Clinton's, quote, indisputable chief advisor. He oversaw the National Performance Review, an effort aimed at reducing governmental waste and fraud. He was heavily involved in promoting information technology and expanding Internet access, popularizing the term information superhighway. He was also a leader on environmental issues, advocating for the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol Treaty for the reduction of greenhouse gases. During the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Gore publicly supported the president despite being privately disgusted by the president's conduct. He said, quote, I've defined my job in exactly the same way for 6 years now, to do everything I can to help him be the best president possible.
Nice. We've got another honorable mention, Gerald Ford. House Minority Leader Gerald Ford became the first vice president to be appointed under the 25th Amendment following the resignation of Spiro Agnew. Now, within weeks of his nomination, the simmering Watergate scandal exploded when Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Now, Vice President Ford is faced with the difficult task of remaining loyal to the president while also remaining free of the scandal's taint.
Yeah.
He's in a tough position here.
He certainly is.
And as he recalled, quote, it was very, very uncomfortable. I disagreed privately with some of the actions that were taken by the Nixon White House. If I was critical of Nixon, the press and the public would have said, well, he was trying to undercut Nixon, so he will get the job. On the other hand, if I stayed too loyal, it might appear that I was supporting somebody who was involved in this very unwise action. So I had to go down this narrow path of not supporting him too much or not criticizing him too frequently. It was not a pleasant experience.
No, I think we could agree that Gerald Ford coming into the vice presidency might have been one of the most difficult situations that a vice president has entered the office on. Yeah, John Tyler with the president dying, that's something. But the president resigning office because of a crime.
Yeah, and
that's pretty huge.
And that was hanging over Nixon pretty much the whole time Ford was vice president. So
and you also got to remember that Gerald Ford wasn't nominated vice president either.
Yeah, he wasn't.
He wasn't on the ticket. Yeah, he replaced Spiro Agnew. it's a one-of-a-kind position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think just in terms of his time as vice president, he walked that narrow path that he mentioned as well as could be expected.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
kept himself clean.
He had to have done as good as he did, because he wouldn't have, it could have been a complete failure.
Well,
if Jerry Ford hadn't handled it the way he did. And when he did become president, he really was the breath of fresh air that the country needed.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the pratfalling jokes and all that,
yeah.
Jerry Ford was kind of necessary for the time, at least in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So thereby he deserves an honorable mention here.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of honorable mentions, we're going to go back into the past here.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we said, Mondale's kind of the turning point, with Nixon as a prototype, and Hobart being a little bit exceptional in his spot. And, of course, Adams setting it up. But this is the only other early vice president on our list here, even as an honorable mention. But George M. Dallas. George Dallas, Pennsylvanian, a state dominated by industries that supported high protectionist tariffs. However, he was vice president under James K. Polk, whose platform was dedicated to cutting tariffs. The House passed the reduced Walker Tariff in 1846, but when it came to a vote in the Senate, there was a 27-27 tie. Dallas broke the tie in favor of the bill, maintaining his loyalty to the president and the party platform, and saying that he could not, quote, narrow his great sphere and act with reference only to Pennsylvania's interests. The vote destroyed his political career in his home state, and he would never be elected to public office again. He sought the 1848 Democratic presidential nomination, but ran in 6th place at the convention, receiving only 3 votes. The only vice presidents who cast more tie-breaking Senate votes than Dallas are John Adams, John C. Calhoun, and current Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yep, and I don't think any vice president ever took such a personal hit to cast a tie-breaking vote for the president.
That's why he's being mentioned here.
That's
because,
right.
I've read Polk's diary.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas, he's not mentioned all that much, but in this case, he really falls on the sword for his president, and that is quite a move.
Yeah. He put the president's agenda over his own personal career.
Right.
Paid the price personally for it, but he's now an honorable mention on the Dead Presidents podcast, so I think that will make it all worth it.
It makes it all worthwhile. And that's going to bring us to our final honorable mention here. Dick Cheney.
Yep. If this were the list of the top 5 most influential or most powerful vice presidents, Cheney would be number 1.
Indeed.
At the outset of his term, when former Vice President Dan Quayle warned him that the job was mostly ceremonial, Cheney said, quote, "I have a different understanding with the president."
Ominous.
And boy, did he ever. He played an unprecedentedly large role in all major areas: national security, the economy, the budget, presidential appointments. He had offices in the West Wing, the Executive Office Building, the Senate, and the House. He was everywhere. He not only sat in on the president's daily intelligence briefings, he had his own briefings beforehand and took that opportunity to shape the president's briefing. He was so powerful that many believed he was the shadow president. George W. Bush, inexperienced in national and foreign policy matters, leaned heavily on Cheney's vast experience. Bush dealt with broad objectives, and Cheney took care of the details with ruthless efficiency. He played a major role in formulating the national response to 9/11 and even took charge in the White House Situation Room on the morning of the attacks. His massive influence, however, did not always necessarily lead to the best results, and his actions came under heavy criticism, For more on that, you might want to stay tuned to our next list, the top 5 worst vice presidents.
That's just it. The top 5 best vice presidents in American history, and a couple honorable mentions there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's a more important position than maybe it was given credit for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it took certain people to make it that way.
Yeah.
And that's why they got on this list here today.
Mm-hmm.
And as we said, next time we're going to look at the 5 worst vice presidents.
Mm-hmm.
Who were the vice presidents that just outright sucked?
Yeah. Well, I think all future vice presidents will be listening to these episodes to find out what to do and what not to do.
Indeed they will, as one would. That being said, for the Dead Presidents Podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I am James J. Hamilton.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.